Welcome to CivilNet. My guest today from New York is Christopher Atamian, who is a writer, a translator, a sometime poet, a filmmaker, and is going to talk to us today about a project of his that just ended. Chris, thank you so much for giving us time on CivilNet.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. I love being here.
Christopher Atamian is the name that is on the book, the Bois de Vincennes, which is the longish essay by Nigoghos Sarafian. And you translated it from the Western Armenian to
Yes, from
English.
Western Armenian.
Tell us about it, about the essay, and what it tries to do before we talk about Sarafian himself.
Well, it's a very beautiful essay, and basically the reason that I translated it, apart from the fact that it's very lyrical and beautiful in its writing, is that it's basically the story of a man who goes back and forth from work to home every day through the Bois de Vincennes, which is a little bit like Central Park in Paris. It's a very large park on the outside of Paris. And in these 70 pages, he's able to personify the trees, the lakes, and tell the story of both the Armenian people in the 20th century, of World War II, of Europe, and his own personal life. And I thought that was a rather remarkable achievement for anyone. And having been brought up in the US and not read that much Armenian literature as a child, I was even more pleasantly surprised to find someone who'd done it in Western Armenian. So that was my original reason for wanting English readers and English language readers to be able to have access to it.
The thing about the read that was so interesting for me is that it was beautiful, it was lyrical, as you said, while it was about two things simultaneously. It was about his present and about his past, a past
Yes.
that was lost at great cost. This is a genocide survivor.
Well, he is in a way. He was born in Varna, which is in Bulgaria today, in the Ottoman Empire, and he lived through the Bolshevik Revolution to begin with, the Russian Revolution, and then saw a lot of the refugees from the genocide. And then, interestingly enough, he's one of the Armenians who went back to Bolis, to Constantinople to study with Hagop Oshagan at Getronagan. So he went back to Turkey, or to the Ottoman Empire, and then left when Mustafa Kemal came back with the troops in 1922. And he then left Turkey and went to Paris. And he wrote in Armenian in Paris with an entire generation of writers called the Menk, or the We generation, who wrote in Armenian while they were living in a French context. And, I think apart from maybe Jewish writers who wrote in Yiddish, it's the only example I know of in the diaspora that produced such beautiful literature in a completely different linguistic and cultural context. So I think there's a lot to be proud of, and it's just fascinating to see that you could keep that up for so long.
And considering that these are survivors, immigrants, first generation, the fact that they're making, that they're dedicating their life to art, to writing, to memoir, assumes that there must have been a readership, an audience, even then?
Yeah, there was an entire life, cultural life in Armenia, in France, that was taking place in Western Armenian, and they met in cafes, and they went out at night dancing, and they, spent weekends together and evenings speaking Armenian, discussing Armenian literature. They also wrote medical treatises. They put on plays. They had really the equivalent maybe of what people in Beirut or Syria have in Armenian communities, but within a Western country, which is even more remarkable, I think.
Except for that Western country was France.
Except that Western country was France, yes. And it lasted a good 40 or 50 years until the 60s or 70s when people started losing the language and the generation sort of died out. It includes Nartuni and Borpuni. Zabel Yeseyan was part of it for a little while before she repatriated to Hayastan, to Armenia. And it's quite an achievement. And there's an entire life of people who also worked in factories. He talks about the Armenians who worked, from morning to night because they had to at the time, doing manual labor, and who wrote at night and stayed up all night trying to forget themselves. There's a very beautiful scene where there's a ball in the park, and actually the cover which was designed by Linda Ganjan, who's a wonderful Armenian-American painter, is actually a scene from that. It's trees with a carousel in the background. And so he talks about an entire lifestyle, and it's also a philosophical treatise. It's about doubt and exile and translation. It's a lot of things rolled up into one. And non-Armenians who have read it, professors in American universities, seem pretty astounded by it. So I was happy to see that they're being introduced to it, and to, you know, everyone has a unique culture, and I think it's a mixture that doesn't really exist in other literatures that I've read. So whether that's a good or a bad thing, I don't know, but it's definitely unique.
The other thing that I found surprising is that this post-genocide generation wrote in prose. Not that nobody's written in prose before, but you know, so much of our literature, even our modern literature, even that period of Soviet Armenian literature, so much of it is poetry.
Right. Well, it's interesting you say that, because Sarafian wrote mainly poetry, but Vorpuni and Artuni and the other writers did write prose. You're right. You know, Ship on a Mountain and Retreat Without a Song were both in prose. And it's some of our greatest writing. Sarafian wrote one book called The Princess, which was a novella in prose, and it's about an Armenian woman who thinks she's Turkish, who marries a Turkish pasha and then discovers she's Armenian at some point during the novella. That's sort of the identity crisis that she has. And apart from that, he really did write a lot of very beautiful poetry, and prose poetry also. This is a little bit of a mixture, right? I mean, it's prose, but it's got a sort of poetic and philosophical bent to it.
Are there other projects up your sleeve of a similar nature? Because that's always an area where we lag, especially now where there are some really good prose writers on the scene, Nancy Krikorian, Chris Bohjalian, but our turn of the century...
Well, they write in English, of course, so I'm actually translating a book by Denis Donikian, who's a French-Armenian writer, who's a wonderful writer, called Offal, like the entrails of an animal. Offal, it's called, and it's just been translated into Eastern Armenian, but I'm translating it from French because he's a French writer. I don't know contemporary Armenian literature from Armenia that well, and I think, apart from Vahid Reberian, I think Armenians don't really write much prose in Armenian anymore, in Western Armenian. So I've translated 3 books from French also in Armenian studies by Mark Nishanian and Grigore Beledian, but they're not prose books per se.
No, they're certainly not. They're
very complicated
critical
theory.
essays, and yeah. And Christopher Atamian, you just concluded a film.
I did. I just did a short film. I've done a couple of short films actually, and this one is an experimental dance film. It takes place on a boat. And I just sent it into the Golden Apricot. It's been in a couple of festivals around the world. And I'm writing a couple of more mainstream scripts. And so hopefully one day you'll be able to see something on the big screen.
Tell us the name of the one you just submitted to Golden Apricot.
It is called Meta Chamber, M-E-T-A, and then Chamber, and then Lux. So Meta Chamber Lux, which means sort of like a rich, chamberish place. It's on the inside of a boat in Chelsea that has been turned into a restaurant now, and it's very beautiful, and it's some dancers, and it's a dreamscape, actually.
Has nothing to do with the rest of our lives. This was fun.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Christopher Atamian, writer, translator, responsible for the English language translation of Nigoghos Sarafian's The Bois de Vincennes, which was published by Wayne State University Press. Thank you, Christopher.
Thank you,
and thank you for watching us on CivilNet.